let us begin for our first Sietar Southeast Asia Book Club. Welcome everybody again. And this afternoon we are looking forward to a conversation with Michael Jenkins, who some of you may know. I know quite well. He's sitting in the living room next to me. But we're going to explore, and he will share some of the themes from his recently published book, Expert Humans, Critical Leadership Skills for a Disrupted World. So I will be handing over to Marie-Thérèse and Artie, who will be moderating that session. But just quickly before we do that, I wanted to quickly go over the agenda. So we'll have quick introductions. Seiji will share any of the technical information, and then we really will focus on the presentation about the themes of the book and discussion of that. And we'll look at some of the future dates for your diary after that. So for those of you who are not familiar with Sietar Southeast Asia, this is what we're about. Sietar is the Society for Intercultural Education, Training and Research. And Sietar Southeast Asia is part of a global network which encourages the development and application of knowledge relating to intercultural and interethnic relations. Those are our values there, and we're open to those who are based in or interested in aspects of cultural developments and practice, particularly in Southeast Asia. As I mentioned, one of the great things about having these virtual sessions is we're able to join with colleagues from all around the world, which is a great privilege. We have a wonderful team who work in Sietar Southeast Asia, who are all volunteers, but who help organize the events. Most of them are present here today. So my name's Joyce, and I'm hosting this event. Judith is here, I see. We also have Seiji, who is leading on the technical side. Srivan, who can't join us today. Greg is also there in KL, joining us from there. And Marie-Thérèse joining from Vienna, who's going to be one of our moderators. And Artie Kelchkar, who's also in Singapore at the moment. So that is our agenda for the day. Without further ado, I am going to hand over to Artie and Marie-Thérèse. Seiji, did you want to give us any technical advice or anything that we need to know before we set off?
I think since last year, everyone's quite familiar with the...
Everyone knows how to use Zoom. So.
But if you can just mute your microphone, like right now, I have ambulance outside, so you can hear that. But if you can mute yourself when you're not talking. And if you have any questions, please do put that into the chat box and we will pick it up later.
Great, thank you, Seiji. And over to you, Artie and Marie-Thérèse. And I will stop sharing and you can carry on.
Okay, hello everyone, very nice to see you again. I've read this book, it's right here. And I was, first of all, thank you very much, Michael, for a book that is written from I would say, practitioner's perspective, right? Very much. And I was a bit wondering about the title first. You expert humans, we're all humans. How can you be an expert human? Yeah. What does it take to be an expert human? So I was wondering a little bit what this means and what, of course, it says critical leaderships for a disrupted world, which is quite a program. But could you explain the reasons behind this title? I mean, the word expert in many ears will be quite negative. The arrogant expert from the worldwide, whatever, yeah, coming to tell us how to do things all over the world. And why this title?
Sure, I'll certainly do that. I can hand back to Artie in just a second, but I could answer your question first, Marie-Thérèse. Well, I think the thing is, I've been working with experts over the past 25 years through the leadership development work that I've been doing, and I guess the very simple answer actually to why the book is called Expert Humans is because it occurred to me, and I think to many other people, that if we could work to help those incredibly talented people, the sort of lawyers, the engineers, the doctors, the hedge fund managers, all of these very, very incredibly talented people who are really fantastic on the technical side. If we could help them to dial up their human qualities, then that would have to be a good thing. And that was really why, very, very, very straightforwardly, I thought that Expert Humans would be a good title for the book. So that's really what led to me choosing that title for this particular book.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, and hi, Mary-Therese, and thanks for that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to dial back a little bit and, introduce Michael here, and then we could probably continue with the Q&A. So welcome everybody to what promises to be an interesting session. Michael has an interesting story and journey. He's based in Singapore presently. He was born in Malaysia, where he spent his early years. He did his postgraduate studies in Japanese language, politics, and economics at Nanzan University, Japan, after which he worked for Toyota Motor Corporation for 4 years. In 2001, after 2 years with INSEAD in France as regional director, Michael returned to Asia as director of INSEAD Executive Education in Singapore. He subsequently took on the role of managing director of the Center for Creative Leadership, Asia Pacific. And in 2009, he joined Roffey Park Institute in the UK as CEO. Moving back to Singapore, Michael joined the Human Capital Leadership Institute as CEO in July 2018, before moving to set up a new company, Expert Humans, in April 2020. The UK's HR magazine named Michael as one of the UK's most influential thinkers in human resources in 2013 and again in 2016. He is a partner of the UK-based Future Work Forum and is a regular contributor at conferences where he talks on topics like humanizing the workplace, leadership development, and sustainability. For those of you who may not know, Michael is married to Joyce, our Sietar C founding member. And a fun fact is that Michael spent part of his childhood in a small town in Uganda and has offered to sing a short song in Buganda dialect, an offer we are more than happy to accept. As you can see, his journey is an interesting one, and Michael has now added one more feather to his cap, that of an author. His book, Expert Humans, Critical Leadership Skills for a Disrupted World, was recently published, and we are thrilled that in the first meeting of our book series today, Michael will be our first author speaker. It's wonderful to have you here, Michael. Welcome and congratulations on the book. Can I ask you to say a few words and perhaps sing a song?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to Sietar Southeast Asia for this very kind introduction, and thank you for making me feel so welcome. I'm going to be sharing a few thoughts via a presentation in just a moment, but as Arti said, I probably very foolishly agreed to sing a song because we thought, well, that's kind of a fun fact that maybe I've not done this before, so this is a first, so you have to bear with me. And also I have to tell you the song is actually very short as well, so you won't have to listen to me singing for very long. The backstory to this is that I used to do quite a lot of work at a training institute in the UK that looked at intercultural issues, and I happened to meet a professor of Swahili and Bantu studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies. And I said to him that as a child, I had learned these songs and I didn't really know what they were about. but I thought, being he was a professor of Swahili and Bantu studies, that he might be able to tell me. So he said, well, go ahead, sing your songs, and I'll tell you what I think afterwards. So I sang my 2 little songs, and he sat there in his armchair with his eyes closed, and then he opened his eyes and he said, well, I can tell you, first of all, that these songs are not in Swahili, which is what I thought they had been in. But they were, in fact, as Arti alluded to earlier, in the Buganda dialect, which is the dialect of eastern Uganda, not far from the Kenyan border. So that was when I finally realized that all these songs I thought were Swahili songs are in fact Buganda. So here's the first one. It's very short. Here it goes. Diki diki donkey ani anyamkie nadukemsinde tumusukeku. It's the first one. I said it was very short, didn't I?
Yeah.
Is Butiko tata tangari mukanga yo oriri yo be benyamenya benya kwakasingire. And that's the second song. So I did tell you it was very short. So that's what those that's what Buganda dialect sounds as remembered by a 6-year-old boy. So hope you enjoyed that. And that has got to be one of the strangest segues into a presentation ever, I think. So thank you for indulging me and listening to me. And I think I can probably, Arti, now go into my presentation, perhaps.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So can I just check that everybody can see the presentation? Okay, I'll just put it into this mode so that we can, oops, have a look. Okay. So what I'm planning to do is a little bit of a scamper through some of the ideas in the book as a way to sort of giving you an idea about it, and then looking forward to sort of discussing with everybody, with Arti and with Marie-Thérèse also, some of the ideas in the book. So it's called Expert Humans, and the subtitle is Critical Leadership Skills for a Disrupted World. And I decided to write this book because I've been pondering compassion, empathy, and altruism for a number of years. And of course, with COVID, I think all of us found that there was quite a lot of time for reflection. I was also interested in thinking about the if you like, the great disruptors of our world. And just to summarize those, it will come as no surprise to anyone on the call, but I've taken in the book a look, if you like, at global health, sustainability, digital transformation, and inequality, and last but not least, trust, and specifically the erosion of trust in institutions and organizations worldwide. And my very simple premise, I guess, in Expert Humans was to then ask the question, to what degree might the application of altruism, compassion, and empathy to these thorny issues of our times be helpful for the human condition? So that was the, if you like, the very sort of simple and straightforward premise of the book. What we'd quite like to do is to ask everybody a question just to get us underway, and this is where we can ask Seiji to work his magic with the Mentimeter. But here's a question that I'd love to ask you, and that is, what do you think is the biggest disruptor for people and organizations out of these 5 disruptors that I've shared with you so far? What do you think is the biggest one that faces us at the moment? So Seiji, is it okay to hand back control to you?
Yep. So I have just posted the Mentimeter link on the chat box. So if you click that, you should be able to see something like this, and you can choose the one that you think the most biggest.
Fabulous.
And we're just waiting for people to complete, and you can see the results here. So slowly we're getting more. And if you'd like just to disrupt the awkward silence, I can play some music.
Very nice. Well, at least we don't have to listen to me singing African songs while we're doing this,
Well,
right?
that could be, we'll pay too much attention to your song. So.
But this is very interesting, actually.
Mhm.
Very interesting. So let me know when you think we're just about there, Seiji.
Yes, I think we are there.
We're there. Okay, lovely. Well, I mean, I think everybody can see the results there. Trust is quite clearly the front runner as far as our group here is concerned in terms of the biggest disruptor for people and organizations at the moment. Very interesting that you guys have come up with that. I also asked a very big Japanese multinational last week the exact same question. And very interestingly, trust came out ahead of all of the other disruptors there. So that's telling us something pretty interesting, I think, about what's happening in organizations, and something that we perhaps should be pretty concerned about, I guess. Maybe we'll return to that a bit later. Seiji, thanks very much indeed. So I'll go back to, I can pick up my screen, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. So just continue from there. Thank you very much for that, Seiji. So, okay, so we're back to my screen now, and here's the very simple model that I've used in the book, which I've called the ACE model, standing for altruism, compassion, and empathy. Is there any significance to the way this is laid out? Well, the significance is that altruism at the center is something that I've often regarded as something very aspirational. And I'll say more about that later when we talk about altruism. Then wrapped around that is compassion. And then on the outer ring, we've got empathy. And as I'll show during the course of the discussion, empathy to me is a segue to compassion. And the big difference between compassion and empathy is that compassion involves action, whereas empathy doesn't necessarily imply action. And more about that later. So those global disruptors and this simple model form the heart of the book. Now, it won't have escaped anybody's notice that empathy and compassion have most definitely entered the business lexicon. I think that the big question for us now is, can we sustain this interest in empathy and compassion as we move into a different phase, let's call it, of the global pandemic? It's really interesting to think that, I guess, 8-9 years ago, when I was personally first exploring compassion, I felt at that time that I almost had to seek permission from my interlocutor, the HR director, CEO of an organization, to even really talk about compassion. Whereas now, I think that people are much more inclined to give you the time of day when you want to talk about compassion. And we'll talk a little bit about some different attitudes to the concept of compassion and empathy a little bit later on in the talk. So the big question is, if COVID-19 has had any silver linings at all in terms of shining a spotlight on the human condition and our ability to be compassionate, empathetic and altruistic, the big question will be, what can we do to make sure that we don't lose that momentum? And the reason why I'm personally quite concerned about it is that if you think back to the global financial crisis of 2008-9, there was a lot of talk after that about how important purpose was in organizational life, and an awful lot of discussion about how we needed to rediscover our purpose and to do things differently. And again, I'm not sure about everyone on the call, but I just wonder whether that was a missed opportunity, because it didn't take very long before some of those financial organizations in particular were circumventing all of the new governance rules put in place to try and control them, underscoring, I think, the fact that this is an issue of culture, not an issue of regulation, I believe. Again, we can touch on that a bit later. So, just very quickly to make the business case for altruism, compassion, and empathy, which is something that in my work life I'm currently busy trying to do. The first thing we know from the research is that compassion promotes what they call effective commitment to the organization, they being the researchers that have looked at compassion. Compassion breeds compassion. So as people model compassionate acts and are seen by others to be compassionate, so others learn and start to think, well, maybe that would be an interesting way to behave. Compassion works both ways. So one of the amazing things about compassion is that very often the impact of the compassionate act is more keenly felt by the person who's actually giving that compassion, rather more so than even the person who is the target or object, I should say, of that compassionate act. The research also suggests that compassion fosters more collaboration in the workplace, and of course that has got to be a good thing. For colleagues who are interested, I'm very happy to sort of share more broadly the research originations of these items. I thought in the interest of time today, I wouldn't show all of those slides. A couple of other things that the research suggests is that more compassionate organizations and more human workplaces help to reduce staff turnover. You'll see stronger bonds developing between co-workers. Very importantly, I think, particularly in the world today, it can reduce the potential for burnout and, importantly, help promote better mental health. And then, last but not least, the research suggests that it creates the right conditions for innovation. And of course, that's strongly correlated with the notion of psychological safe spaces and the ability for people to speak up and to share their ideas without fear of being castigated in any way, or having other people feel that perhaps their idea isn't a good one, because you've got that atmosphere of safety and warmth. In terms of empathy, empathy is again strongly associated with ethical decision making. If we're able to empathize with the people that we're working with in order to bring them on side to understand the kind of decisions that we're making, it can only be of benefit. The research is very strong in terms of better outcomes in healthcare, which is very interesting because paradoxically, hospitals are not necessarily strongly associated with empathy, and neither are doctors for that matter. But studies have shown in the US that groups of people, cohort groups, that are put through what Americans call virtuousness training, those cohort groups perform much better on standard KPIs and metrics than do groups that have not been put through that kind of training. And the metrics are very, very interesting because not only do the people, for example, in care homes report higher levels of satisfaction with the care that they're getting, but very interestingly, as the studies become more longitudinal, the evidence builds that mortality rates are actually improved. In other words, people live longer because they're being cared for by people who empathize with them, who care for them in a very, very profound way. And then with all of the experts that we have on the call today, that skill of empathy is clearly something that's very important for leaders who are working across cultures and within leading diverse and culturally diverse teams. The ability to empathize, I think, cannot be understated. We'll come back to that as we go through the presentation. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the great work of Amy Edmondson, Harvard professor, who's done a lot of work on the creation of psychological safe spaces. for those of you interested in learning more, thoroughly recommend her book, and I've referenced her a couple of times in Expert Humans. Basically, what Amy is saying is that the fearless organization is one in which interpersonal fear is minimized so that the team and organizational performance can be maximized in this knowledge-intensive world. And she gives some great examples, for example, of companies like Nokia, Volkswagen, where the business issues that those companies had, and in the case of Nokia, the missing of the innovation boat, were rather less to do with technical lack of competence and much more to do with the type of organizational culture that was created by the people at the top of those organizations. So at the time that Nokia was losing the technological battle to Apple, the culture was very, very toxic, and it was attributable to the propensity of the CEO to walk the corridors literally shouting at people. And again, we have data that shows that where employees report high levels of shouting by leaders, this correlates with, as you can imagine, low psychological safety and a whole range of other very negative data. So psychological safe spaces, absolutely critical. I've mentioned the promotion of better mental health. I think, again, as we go through, this will become clearer and clearer, I think, if it's not already clear already. I think it's critical for building trust in organizations too, that we have a more humane approach, a more human approach. We've seen in the Mentimeter that we just did that of all of those disruptors, trust and the crisis in trust perhaps is not too much to understate that, really needs some kind of help and attention. So some of the benefits therefore accruing to, that's my cat arriving, some of the benefits accruing to us, I think, as a result of trying to use altruism, compassion, and empathy in our human capital management practices are all of these things that we see here. And so the reason why I'm sharing this with you is that I want to sort of, if perhaps you don't remember anything at all of this presentation or conversation, I really want to underscore the notion that compassion and being a compassionate leader, being an empathetic person and being altruistic is not easy. But the benefits are clearly there, both for human beings and for organizations. So going a little bit deeper into this model, I wanted to just share a few ideas with you about altruism, compassion, and empathy. And I'm going to turn to Seiji just to see whether he can orchestrate a second Mentimeter for us. Are you okay to do that, Seiji?
Yes, so I have just posted another link, the same link, but if you click it, you should be able to see the options to choose which one is the first, second, and third.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
And I am just going to share my screen for that.
Fabulous. Thank you, Seiji.
So you should be able to see something like this, and you just need to choose which one are the first and the second and third.
Thank you very much. This will be very, very interesting to see.
Right.
So Seiji, I think we're more or less there.
Yeah, I think so.
Which is interesting. So, oh, how interesting. This is really interesting. So we've got empathy, which is slightly ahead, well, a little bit ahead of compassion, altruism in third place there, perhaps not so surprising. I'm very interesting, certainly from my perspective, to sort of see what the results have been. And this underscores, I think, one of the interesting features, but also one of the challenges, which is that empathy is arguably a bit more accessible to people than compassion perhaps is as a concept. And we'll come to perhaps why that is in just a few slides more. So Seiji, thank you very much indeed for conducting that poll for us. I'll just go back to my presentation. Okay, so
Did we just lose Michael?
I think we did somehow. It was
Yes.
frozen.
Yes.
I lost track.
Did. Yeah.
Okay, one moment, please.
Joyce is still there, so she might hear it.
Yes.
Oh, he's back. He's back.
So I think one of the big sayings of our era will be "you're on mute," right? Because everybody will say that. So so sorry about that. Altruism, yes. I think I was saying that it was first used by this French philosopher Auguste Comte, and it was used to describe the opposite of egoism. I'm not going to go through every item here, but just a couple of things to perhaps mention.
Michael, could you reshare this slide, please?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Just 1 second. Seiji, I'm just trying to relocate where the share function is now.
If not, I can share that on my screen. One moment, please.
Okay, maybe that's the easiest to do, and then I'll just say next slide then.
Yeah. One moment, please.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry about the technical glitches. We always have to suffer from the technical issues sometimes,
no worries.
and just to pretend that we are not panicking.
Exactly.
Please.
So this Japanese you.
Okay. Here you go.
Lovely. Thank you, Seiji. So yes, we'll go to the next slide then. And I won't reprise what I said just now, but the definition of altruism is the moral practice of concern for the happiness of other people. And critically, of course, it appears as a virtue in many cultures, and it's also central to a number of world religions. If you go to the next slide, Seiji. One of the things that I found very interesting while I was doing the research for the book is the types of altruism that we have to think about. So at the top there, you've got general altruism, which is the motivation to do good things for others. And then you can see right at the very bottom there, that aspect of selflessness, where an example might be donating a kidney or a vital organ to a complete stranger, as a very extreme example of how altruism can manifest itself. What was of interest to me, and particularly in a business context, is the concept of virtue signaling, which you'll see in the middle of the chart there, which is doing something for others out of a desire for recognition or publicity. And this is something that I think is something we need to be aware of when we think of organizations, companies are approaching the topic of sustainability. So one of the manifestations of this is greenwashing, of course. Perhaps more about that later when we talk. So Seiji, the next slide, please. So just a really super quick look at compassion as well. And these are just sort of some edited highlights to sort of share with you. And we go to the next slide here. I quite liked this reflection, if you like, about what compassion needs to have in order to be compassion. So firstly, people must feel that the troubles that evoke their feelings are serious. So when we're having an interaction with people that is going to result in a compassionate action or outcome, we need to feel that the troubles that are evoking these feelings are actually serious. We also need to understand that sufferers' troubles are not self-inflicted. And this is where, if you like, subcomponents of compassion come into play, such as being non-judgmental. When people come to us with problems, sometimes we think to ourselves, well, I've listened to your problems, and actually, those are not problems. You should listen to my problems. Those are real problems. Or we will make a judgment where we'll say, well, that's the problem that you're experiencing, or the pickle, or the issues that you're having to you're challenged with right now, they're of your own making. So you've made your bed, you lie in it. We have to resist the human tendency to sometimes react in that way, and feel that people who are suffering, who are in pain, that their troubles are not self-inflicted. And very importantly, as we interact and as we seek to be more compassionate ourselves, I think it's very important for us to try to picture ourselves with the same problems in this kind of non-blaming and non-shaming manner. Some very heavy things to, I think about here, but I quite liked the way that this was captured by this quotation. Again, something to reflect on. Seiji, we'll move to the next slide. Again, just a very quick look at a couple of aspects of empathy. If we go to the next slide, you'll see here that a definition of empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And this, of course, doesn't really do justice to the whole area of empathy by any stretch of the imagination. But what it does do is throw up very interesting ideas about what happens in early childhood, for example. There's very interesting work, I think, that connects with empathy, done by John Bowlby and others on attachment theory, the development of secure bases, for example. This gave rise to leadership thinking around secure base leadership. To what degree, for example, can we replicate in the workplace this feeling that the manager or leader is that rock that we had when we were children, for example? Not suggesting paternalism, but just suggesting that for us to have more human workplaces, we need leaders and managers that can represent, if you like, a kind of secure base. And again, I've talked a little bit at length about that in the book itself. If you go to the next slide then, Seiji. This is a fairly recent report, and the reason why I thought I'd share it with you is that the fact that there is a thing called the State of Workplace Empathy 2020 report would suggest that empathy is becoming more mainstream as a concept in business life. And as you sort of glance through some of the statistics that you can see there, some very interesting things that we might have been able to predict, which is that CEOs very often can inhabit a bubble where they think that everything is actually fine and dandy, whereas in fact the reality on the ground is actually rather different. So you can see here that only at the top, I'll just read out one statistic there. Only 48% of employees believe companies as a whole are empathetic versus 86% of CEOs. So again, what's going on there? I think very interesting to reflect on. And then we'll move to the next slide then, Seiji. And this is one that I, again, quite wanted to share with you, which is that empathy is a great concept, but it is subject to bias. And so the fact is that we're prone to feel empathy for attractive people and for people who look like us and who share our ethnic or national background. This has implications, I think, for people in the field where Sietar does all of its work. The book that I've quoted from here is called Against Empathy, and it's written by the Canadian psychologist Paul Bloom. And if you're interested to go deeper into empathy, I thoroughly recommend this as something to read. We'll go to the next slide then, Seiji. A couple of last points before we get into the discussion with Artie and Marie-Thérèse. I wanted to flag up something called weak tie networks, which is something that I was experimenting with as a sort of thought from about 2 years ago. While I was thinking about compassion and empathy, I happened across a study that was being done actually in China, looking at the care of dementia patients and people with advanced Alzheimer's. And they were exploring the applicability of weak tie networks to helping these people to live a more comfortable life, particularly in the end of life phase. And what weak tie networks are, in a nutshell, these are the relationships that we have with a whole range of people who inhabit our everyday landscape of life. So it's the street cleaner, it's the security guard for those of you who live in countries that have security guards. It's the barista at your local Starbucks, for example, who might not know your name, but she or he knows your order and will make your order as you come in. And very, very fascinatingly with weak tie networks, in the moment that you say good morning to the security guard or to the driver of the bus that takes your children to school, as they recognize you and you recognize them, really good things happen in your brain. Feel good chemicals, to put it simplistically, bathe your brain. And what it's saying to us is we are actually taking up space in the cosmos, that we actually exist. And what's so critical about this is that older people, when they reflect on their lives and they talk to carers about how they're feeling, they will often report that they feel like they're not seen anymore. They will say that they don't feel like they take up space in the universe. And so weak tie networks are very important from a psychological well-being point of view. But here's another thing. For those of you who are interested to look at this more, and we'll go to the next slide, please, Seiji. Please do take a look at the work of Mark Granovetter, who was one of the first person to coin the term weak ties, because he's done some very convincing work that shows that when it comes to innovation, new thinking, our over-reliance on our strong tie networks, in other words, the opposite of weak tie networks, means that we're constantly returning to the same pool of knowledge and thought and expertise, whereas what we really should be doing is actually increasing the number of people in our weak tie networks and building links with those people, to the point where perhaps we do grow to know their names and so forth. I think there's some work to be done which is not yet started in the space between weak tie networks and strong tie networks. I think there's a space in between, which at the moment I'm calling middle ground, but I think there's scope for us to broaden our relationships with people, not only in the interests of promoting more human interaction, but also if you want to boil it down to a business imperative, I think doing this will help us to become more creative and more innovative. So we'll go to the next slide, Seiji, and we're sort of coming to the end of the slide presentation. I've included in the book just some questions that we can ask ourselves as we seek to develop our own compassion. Simple things like reflecting on how often you talk about I, me at the expense of we and us. As we start to move out of the COVID phase, maybe, you know, those terrible networking things that we used to have to go to, where we have to make polite conversation with people who don't really want to be there, like we don't want to be there. That's the perspective of an introvert, of course. Challenge yourself when you have the opportunity to do that, to spend the first 10 to 15 minutes of an interaction with a brand new person who you've never seen before, and try not to use the word I. It's really difficult, and but it's a great way to sort of think about the other person and to direct your friendliness in that direction. So we'll go to the next slide then, Seiji, which is the last slide. Just some real high-level points I wanted to make about psychological safety being critical. Safe spaces, again from a business point of view. Safe spaces encourage people to stay on. And importantly, with our technological advancements, we can learn a lot about a company that has given us a job offer way before we set foot in the door of that organization. And if it has a bad reputation that we can find out through apps like Glassdoor, etc., then people are just not going to join. So employer brand is another business positive outcome that can happen. Those last couple of points, I think we have to add in trust. That I'm very interested to see that you all flag that up as the critical thing. And if it can help, even in a small measure, I think applying those aspects of ACE, of altruism, compassion, and empathy, I hope they can help in the creation of more human workplaces. And then last but not least, don't forget to develop your weak tie networks as well, because I think that's something that we're going to see more of in the future. And with that, I will stop so that we have a little bit of time to have a chat. So thank you, Seiji, for sharing the slides. And I think I'm handing back to Artie now.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting, very insightful, a lot of takeaways. I think Marie-Thérèse and I both have some questions for you before we open this up. Marie-Thérèse, would you like to go first?
All right, thank you very much, Artie. Thank you, Michael, for a very good overview of your book. It really gives us the most important aspects. I must say I was really fascinated by this idea of weak links, weak tie networks, which is something I'd heard about it, but now I got the idea and I see how important it is actually. On the other hand, you know, there will be an economic crisis after the pandemic. And I think altruism and compassion will be at the same time more necessary in that crisis that we are facing, and at the same time more difficult because other priorities will dominate, I think. So how do you think we can convince business leaders that, you know, it would still be a priority, this compassion, this altruism, this ACE model, even if, you know, money will be difficult and unemployment will rise and we will have all these issues that they will have to deal with. So is it going to be something that we'll lose again, that, you know, we will backtrack on? Or do you think that it is even more important, but how then can we convince leaders?
Marie-Therese, I think it's a great question. I think there's a very real danger that we will backtrack, and some of the experiences that we've been through this terrible global pandemic may be lost. But I think not all is lost, because we've got evidence, for example, of people like Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, who's made it very, very clear that from a sustainability point of view, those organizations that are not able to prove their sustainability credentials are not going to be able to get funding. In other words, they're not going to be able to get financial support going forward. And I can see this becoming more and more stringent as we go forward. And to me, there's a very strong connection between, for example, altruism. And the reason why I say that is that when you think about altruism and extreme forms of altruism, in other words, doing things for people who maybe you don't even know. So for instance, the example I gave about giving a kidney to somebody who you don't even know, this kind of thing does actually happen. What could be more altruistic than us working hard and agitating for the sustainability of not just the world, but from the world, our society? Being altruistic, we are being altruistic to save people who actually don't even exist yet. So these are our descendants that have not yet been born. And in a way, if you think about it, what could be more altruistic than that? To actually be working now in order to preserve and keep the planet in some sort of shape that the people who come after us, who don't even exist yet, can actually enjoy. So that would be one thing. The second thing is that we hear a lot about empathy from the business community at the moment. And it might be interesting for you to know that empathy is actually a very new, comparatively new construct. It comes from the German Einfühlung, which means in feeling. And it was an import by German psychology emigres in the early part of the 19th century, who brought this concept, which had previously been rendered by the word sympathy, but they wanted to make a distinction between sympathy and empathy. And I discuss this a little bit in the book. And so empathy has come to have this kind of ring to it, which feels quasi-scientific in a way that compassion is not. So we hear quite a lot of business leaders now saying, oh yes, we want to be more empathetic. And when rather challenging people like me say, well, what does that look like then? How are you going to bring empathy into your organizations? You find them then transfixed in the headlights of a car, where they say, well, we're going to listen more to the people. We're going to listen really carefully to what people say. And while I'm kind of being slightly scornful of that, it's a starting point. Listening to people, really listening to people and being present for them is obviously a good starting point. But to come back to your question, Marie-Therese, what can we do to make this stick going forward? I think it's about senior leaders normalizing the use of language like empathy and compassion and that means telling stories about empathy, about empathetic behavior that the employees have exhibited. It means HR, for example, taking a very close look at all of the policies, procedures, and systems that are in place that kind of provide the rules and the grid lines for organizational life, and ask the question, are these really fit for purpose? Are these really as empathetic as they could be? Do they really take into consideration the lives of real people right now, particularly in this particular era? So I think there's a huge number of very practical things that business leaders can do to ensure that empathy and compassion doesn't go the way of purpose, like purpose did in the post-financial global financial scandal.
Thank you.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Okay, so that is interesting, Michael. I like the way you draw this distinction between empathy and compassion. In your book too, there's a lot of interesting detail there. So while on this theme, I was curious to ask you, as to how the ACE model plays out in Asia. At the risk of stereotyping, do you see qualities like compassion and empathy prevalent or more prevalent amongst Asian leaders?
It's a great question, Arti, and I think my response would have to be that it's very mixed, I think, in terms of the examples that we see of compassionate and empathetic leaders in Asia, and whether or not that's a particular hallmark of, let's say, business or work life in our part of the world. I mean, I think Jeff Ong was with us a little bit earlier on. There he is. Hello, Jeff. Jeff and I were in Bangkok at one point, and we did a whole day workshop, which was looking at humanizing the workplace, and we talked about compassion. And what was really interesting, and I think, Jeff, you remember this very well, we were there shortly after the King of Thailand passed away. And Ordinary Thais, who we spoke to, in the days after that, were saying that compassionate leadership as a concept had really surged to the fore in Thailand because the king really embodied compassionate leadership. So answering your question, I think it ranges, I think, in terms of intensity across Asia. And I think it ebbs and flows as well with the comings and going, particularly of political leaders. I think if we include New Zealand, for instance, in the Asia Pacific more broadly, I think you've probably seen Jacinda Ardern has been lauded as, again, the epitome of a compassionate leader. Now, I think it's fantastic what she's done, but I think there are other things that she did that enabled them to be very successful, I think, in their handling of COVID-19, not least making decisions quickly and building trust. So these are things, very practical things that a compassionate leader like Jacinda Ardern managed to do, which I think are much less to do with her being or what her gender is, and much more to do with her competence as a leader. And that's why if there's one hobby horse I do have in relation to the ACE area, it's this. We mustn't allow concepts like compassion to become gender specific. In other words, we need to hold men to very high standards in terms of being compassionate. In other words, to not say that being compassionate is a feminine attribute. This is not a good situation, because it doesn't do any favors to women, and it allows men to perpetuate some of the really dysfunctional leadership behaviors that we've seen that has got us into so much trouble.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat box.
Yes, yes.
From Eureka.
Eureka has mentioned, yes, Eureka, I'm just pulling up your question here. Right, I think many of us want to strive to be altruistic, but being truly altruistic is not easy. Yes, some of us might volunteer because we feel good about spending time giving to others. Is true altruism possible, and is that what we should strive for, or if we get some satisfaction in our actions? It's a great question. My personal view is that I said right at the beginning that I feel that altruism is aspirational. I think it's a journey, not an end. I think what you've mentioned here about volunteering is something that I've suggested in the book is something we could do more of. I think it's a very good way to, it's a very practical manifestation, I think, of altruism. And at the same time, I think we've got to recognize that there's certain kinds of altruism. One of them is mixed altruism, for example, where we do something that benefits people, society, and so forth, but that also benefits us. And sometimes we have to do that. So an example would be, for instance, working at an animal shelter. You know, you could say that's a very good thing because it's looking after animals and so forth. But we all know that we also have to live and we also have to survive. So if we can get some money ourselves by working in this kind of way, then why wouldn't we do that? So I think we can get some satisfaction from doing that. The other thing I'd say is that for a long time, altruism was something that a lot of scholars and intellectuals could not agree on, because at a fundamental level, for a long time, it was in conflict with Darwinian theory of the evolution of man. In other words, put very, very crudely, very, very simply, forgive me, but how can, for example, an idea like survival of the fittest be compatible with altruism, for example, which is about other people, not about you? And the answer to that was suggested by a group of mathematicians from Princeton about 3 decades ago, using yeast as an example. And without going into all of the details, the idea is that if we can be altruistic such that it benefits everybody, actually, that's a very good way to perpetuate the human race, if you like. So again, I've discussed it a little bit in my book, and it's, I think, a very, very interesting question, Eureka. I think we have to strive to do our best, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eureka. George has said, I'm working to create a game for men's referral from toxicity, realities, and labels. I'm interested in perspectives on important steps in creating, stimulating men's courage to feeling and its expression. George, do you want to say more? Is George on the line? George, yeah.
Well, I talk too much, but basically, we're dealing with a situation in which men are disposable, in the sense that they are disposable in the workforce, disposable in the military, and they must strive to achieve certain masculine attributes for shaping and supplying the world, and this role is disappearing. So it's not surprising that, for example, in the UK, 80% of suicides are young men, young between 19 and 49, okay? I have been working in men's stuff for 30, 40 years now, and trying to deal with how do we use male virtues that we are already convinced of to acquire the other virtues, rather than just saying, throw away all that masculine stuff and adopt these other softer, whatever you want to call it. So that's what I'm struggling with. And I create games, as most of you know, and this is the topic that I'm really working on at the moment.
Well, George, thank you very much. I think what I'd like to say is that I mentioned earlier that compassion and being a compassionate leader is not an easy thing, and I think that that there's one thing I sometimes ask groups of people, which is that if you need to, and to put it bluntly, if you need to fire somebody, you need to exit somebody. Is it better to do it before Christmas or after Christmas? And instead of Christmas, you could switch it out for a significant event or festival in your own cultural context. And it's really interesting to see how the group moves on that. It usually splits 50-50 actually, where some people think it's better to tell the person after Christmas because you don't want to visit bad news on them. And sometimes you get people saying, well, actually, I think you should tell them before Christmas because otherwise they're going to max out their credit card and they're not going to thank you in January when they've got a huge credit card bill to pay. And so I guess what I'm saying here is that the ability to let somebody go in a compassionate way is a very difficult thing, I think, for both men and women to have to handle. And when we talk to, for example, frontline managers in organizations, they say, oh yeah, I like the idea of being compassionate and a more human manager. But I'm worried that people will see me as a weak leader. And I think for men, it's some notion that it compromises their masculinity as a leader. And I think we need to work very hard to provide an alternative narrative to that. That in fact we can help people. People can learn how to have these conversations whereby they can be both compassionate and hold people accountable. And that's why I think that, first of all, I mean, you very handily used the word soft skills. I think a lot of us around the table today would say that the so-called soft skills that you quite rightly brought up are in fact the hard skills. Those are the most difficult things for us to do. And the so-called hard skills are actually more straightforward. So I think this is a debate that's going to run and run. But the fact that we have the debate, I think is really very, very encouraging. So thanks, George.
I'm telling people that, you know, use courage, masculinity, your strength to do the things that are difficult, like
right.
skills.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a great message.
Thank you.
Great message. Yes. So Jeff has put a question in the chat here too.
Michael, I think Philip is raising his hand.
Oh, beg your pardon, Philip. I'm sorry. So, well, Jeff, can I come back to you in a moment then, and maybe talk about what you've just mentioned? So, Phil, go ahead.
Michael, how good to see you again. And George, nice to see you too. Long time. Thank you, Michael. Great presentation. My perspective on this is that what we talk about happens isn't what really happens. And I think that the workplace and society is a lot kinder and a lot more compassionate than we actually know. I'm sure everybody listening tonight will remember great movements forward in their life where compassion has been the strongest. And I wasn't going to say something, but you tripped me into speaking about survival of the fittest, because now there's research that actually begins to say that wasn't how humankind developed at all. It was actually survival of the kindest.
Right.
And that there's now research that it wasn't, you know, the nature red in tooth and claw that was all about, you know, screwing your neighbor and getting on top. Society survived by caring for each other.
Right.
So I think we've taken this whole notion of survival of the fittest and applied it and said, oh, kindness doesn't exist in the workplace. But I actually think it does. And there's research by Professor Kellner at Berkeley on awesomeness, who actually says when you're exposed to awe, it actually reveals chemicals which boost your compassion. And in my own research on synchronicity, which you know a little bit about,
I do, yes.
I come up with the notion of what I've called the servant citizen, whereby people in my research say that synchronicity happens to them, i.e. out of the blue events come to them, when they are focused on helping somebody else. So I love, Michael, you know, I love your work, I always have. But what I think I want to say is that kindness and compassion is a lot more prevalent than we know. We just don't talk about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great contribution, Phil, to the debate. And I think it's something we should build on. And what I mean by that is that we probably need more stories, actually, more stories of kindness and compassion to be able to, you know, really push the message home. And maybe if we do that, then we won't lose some of the gains that we've made, perhaps, during this, you know, this terrible COVID era.
Thank you, Michael. Great book, great contribution.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you. Jeff, would you like to say a little bit about your question? And then I'll hand back to Artie and Marie-Therese.
I was just reflecting on what you're saying and musing over it. So this is not really thought through, but if we're to just look at societies, right? And we have laws put in place to moderate the behavior where norms, you know, might not work. So you take in classic Singapore 60s, littering, right? We just throw things, it's easy. So you put laws in place to moderate that behavior. Then I suppose if ACE is something like that, not something that we are more inclined to do in organizations, although I hear Phil might challenge that. But if it's more akin to a norm, then how do we develop these norms, right? Across the board. And is there another perspective that might challenge this? And I'll read up on what Phil is saying. Perhaps that might challenge this notion. So I got my answer there.
Jeff, I mentioned a couple of times the great financial crisis and the resurgence in the interest of purpose at that time. There was some really interesting work done by Edelman. Edelman are the people who put out the annual trust barometer, which sort of measures trust in different organizations around the world. And they came to the conclusion about 5 to 6 years after the global financial crash that no amount of laws, lawmaking, extra governance, more regulation actually shifted the needle in terms of keeping organizations behaving well. And they surmised that it was all about culture, the culture of those organizations. And so you cited some examples of Singapore in the 60s and so forth, no littering and so on and so forth. I may be biased, but I like to feel that as I go about my daily business in Singapore, little acts of kindness, I feel, and maybe it's just because I'm noticing it more, I feel there's a bit more of that, to be honest. And that's not mandated by government. It maybe is prompted by information campaigns and so forth. So we do have posters that say, why don't you give up your seat on the bus to somebody who needs it more? So there are those nudges, if you like. But I like to think that, building on what Phil said earlier, maybe, that maybe it's not too naive or too simplistic to assume that perhaps we might expect, more kindness and more compassion to actually come into the society without us having to legislate for it. But to be continued, Jeff. I think it's a great, great observation.
Thanks. Over beer, of course.
Just to let you know,
of course, yes.
Vincent had his hand raised for some time.
Sorry. Should we take that as the last question, Vincent? My apologies. This is the challenge with Zoom.
No, I had my hand up from the very beginning.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Okay, go ahead.
Maybe you look too much at the chat. No, I'm kidding. No, thank you, Michael, and hi, Philip, and everybody, and George, all the usual suspects here. Great to see you all. Michael, thank you very much. Excellent. I have a comment and a question. I like to put diversity inclusion and then extend the paradigm into belonging and ultimately well-being. Now, I was wondering, very often people ask me, what is belonging, the sense of belonging compared to inclusion? And I keep saying, this is, going deeper, broader into creating the psychological safety, etc. And I realize now that I think this ACE model might be an answer to that, because I think I take empathy as a prerequisite anywhere, certainly everywhere. We need that. I'm a little bit concerned about the compassion, because for me, compassion is also a bit like sympathy, and I think it just goes too far. And I'd like to have you mentioned that in your presentation between the difference between sympathy and compassion. To me, I like the compassion, but also again it goes too far. I mean, in a professional setting, empathy again, clear, but compassion, sympathy, is it not going too far, or is that it still shape this sense of belonging? I'd like to have your views on that.
Sure.
On the way to well-being, ultimately, obviously. Yeah.
Sure. Well, another lovely question, Vincent. Thank you very much indeed. Well, the interesting thing is that I think words come along with the cultural baggage. And when I was talking to my Spanish brother-in-law actually about compassion and empathy, he said, well, in this very Catholic country that we're in, the word compassion has a lot of interesting associations. So you need to be aware of that, Michael, as you push this notion of compassion, which is a really, really important point to bear in mind. A couple of things, I think, which I haven't had a chance to mention, is that compassion to me is not only about action, but it's also about looking after yourself as well. So there's a whole area, I'm sure you know, burgeoning area of study around self-compassion. And Kristen Neff, for instance, is one of the leading, I guess, researchers in the area of self-compassion. If anyone's in the UK, Seiji, there's a lady called Amanda Super, very easy to remember, Amanda, and then her family name is Super, and she does some super work in the area of self-compassion. And then, of course, everybody knows Brené Brown as well, and her work in terms of vulnerability and so forth. I think there's a huge amount of work more to be done in terms of understanding the interplay between compassion and self-compassion. So, for instance, when I've spoken to NHS groups in the UK, for instance, they talk about how, as nurses, they feel very high levels of compassion towards the people that they care for, but they feel that they don't have enough time to practice what you might call, well, what we would call self-compassion. And so you find a lot of burnout, a lot of what I would call martyr syndrome happening in that particular area. Another fascinating area, of course, for discussion, maybe at another time, is the existence of corporate narcissists and corporate psychopaths for whom self-compassion has morphed into something entirely uglier. But compassion also means calling those people out and making sure that that we deal with them in the way that leaders should deal with. Maybe I'll make one final comment, hand back to Arti and Marie-Therese. I was talking about compassion to a group of global insurers. So it's a big insurance company. And one of the guys halfway through, he said to me, Michael, I think I've got this compassion thing. He said, yeah, I think I've got this compassion thing. And I said, well, how have you got it? And he said, well, I've only really got one question for you. And that is, when do you switch it off? And I said, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm following you. Switch what off? And he said, compassion, you know, like when you've been nice to people and you've asked them how their wife is and you kind of know their kids' names and you ask whether they're doing well in college. When you've done all of that kind of stuff with people and they still won't do what you tell them to do, then you've got to switch the compassion off, right? And I said, no, that's not what I'm talking about at all. And he then checked out because he thought, you know, I'm not going to listen to this anymore. At the end of the session, the two HR directors who had asked me to do this talk for them, they waited while I cleared up my laptop and so forth. And then they said, you know, we hope that he wasn't a bit rough. And I said, no, it's fine. I mean, he has his own opinion. That's absolutely fine. And then they said to me, you might be interested to know that he's the subject of not one, but two bullying cases within the organization. And I said, oh, well, that's very interesting, isn't it? And they sort of kind of looked at each other. And then I said, do I get to ask a question now? And they said, yeah, sure. And I said, is he by any chance your top earner? Is he by any chance the person who brings in all of the dosh? And they looked at each other and they didn't say anything. And I said, he is, isn't he? And they said, yeah, he's our best earner. And I said, well, the question for you then is, are you happy to have that kind of culture in your organization? Those are the questions you need to ask. Because if it was me, it would be a decision of a monumentally ethical nature. And that's what you've got to ask yourself. So,
Michael, can I jump in? Sorry, I must say something now. There's a whole burgeoning industry called compassion fatigue. I put in the link here. I'm now doing a diploma in compassion fatigue. Take a look at it.
Oh, I will do.
I think it links to what you just said. Very often compassion is fake and it actually burns the person out. So there's a whole need now for us to begin to understand those who just switch on a nice smiley face actually very often are doing damage to themselves. And it's literally called compassion fatigue. Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
no,
on
with what you were saying.
That's a great point. That's a great point, Phil. Thank you very much indeed. I'm looking at the time. It's 6:25. RTI and Marie-Thérèse, I should hand back to you guys because I know that you've got some business to attend to.
No worries, Michael. This was really interesting. But I noticed that there is a question from Natalie, which we could probably take for a quick minute or so.
Sure,
yeah,
of course, yes.
Yeah, so let me read it out. It says, from your perspective, what are the main individual and organizational level obstacles to developing ACE qualities in leaders? So what are the main obstacles to developing ACE qualities in leaders? Yeah.
Well, it's a great question, and thank you for that question. I think we're in a time in history where the fundamentals of leadership are beginning to change, and the expectations that people have of their leaders are beginning to change. So 8 years ago, as I mentioned briefly, when I tried to talk about compassion with business leaders, it was like, oh, don't waste my time. Now the climate seems to be different. But here's the thing. There are some studies that suggest that, for example, when you're putting together development experiences for people, when you're putting together leadership programs for people, for instance, introducing components around, for example, empathy, around self-compassion, and actively involving a multi-generational approach to the design and delivery of those kinds of programs. It may be too early to say, but it looks like there's a lot of promise there in terms of, and just coming back to answering your question, Natalia, how can we make it happen? I think we've got to involve the different generations with organizations in terms of deciding and designing what kind of development opportunities we give to people, to give people the chance to learn these things, because I do believe that they are all learnable qualities. It's just that we've got to figure out an accessible, exciting, and interesting way for people to take these ACE attributes on board. There's much more to say. I'm sorry, there's probably not so much time to expound further, but thank you for your question.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to everybody who participated. I'm going to now hand it over to Joyce to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Arti. Thank you, Marie-Thérèse. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Arti. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We've run out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you all for joining our first book club event, and we look forward to many more. We will be sending you all details of the upcoming events that we're holding. So we have a May, actually I'll share my screen, but for those of you who are still here, some of the events that are coming up, but we will also be sending you details. So for example, in May, we have got Kyle Hegarty, I think he's here. We'll be looking at case studies using real world situations in cross-cultural team building. And on June the 17th, we'll have Professor Andy Molinsky introducing cultural dexterity. I've also put here details for anyone who did want to purchase the Expert Humans book, Michael's book. So you can get discounts directly. You can, I believe, just buy on Amazon, but you can also contact the publisher directly. And if you use the discount code Expert Humans, you'll get around about 20% discount on the book. For those in Singapore, the distributor details are there as well, but we'll send those to you as well, so you don't need to write anything down. But thank you all for joining. Thank you for the lively discussions and the ideas and exchanging ideas for how we can put forward some of these concepts in the work that we do as interculturalists. And we look forward to further exchanges in the future. if any of you have ideas for other books that either you have written yourself or you have recommendations of that you would like to talk about or to share with others in the network, please get in touch with us. And likewise, if you have ideas for other sessions or events that you would like to hold as part of the Sietar network, then do get in touch. And great as always to see many of you joining here. And thank you for taking part. We'll see you all again. So have a good rest of your week. Bye-bye. My cat's coming to say goodbye now. She stopped